At the romantic party my wife left me to dance with her lover, so I went to them and said to her, I don't know what I did to you, to trade me for another man like that in front of me, but I hope you're happy with your choice. She looked at me with eyes filled with a regret that seemed too late, and yet she tried to find me days later, devastated by what she had done, as if an apology would erase the moment I felt invisible, disposable, replaceable in the crowd celebrating love while mine was shattered at my feet. When she found me, looking at me as if I were still the home she longed to return to, I said to her in the calmest voice I could muster after so much silent shattering, I want you to know that I loved you with all my heart, but if it wasn't enough, move on and be happy with someone else who loves you more than I did. And then I left, not just from our home, but from her life. What she didn't expect was that, seeing me go, something in her would break too, and that this emptiness would grow over time, until it filled everything. And that one day, much later, when I finally found myself again, there would be no more room for her to return. I can't pinpoint the exact moment I stopped feeling like a husband and started feeling like a mistake. Maybe it was even before that party, when she started looking away even though she was sitting across from me. When she started trading her easy laughter for short answers, when her hugs became lighter, as if they were in a hurry. Maybe it was right then, but I persisted, thinking it was a phase, a tiredness, something that would pass. After all, every couple has ups and downs, right? But I was wrong. What was happening wasn't a phase, it was a silent breakup she had already begun, only I didn't know it. And then came the day of the party. It was a night to celebrate love, to renew promises, to dance hand in hand, to remember the reasons we chose each other. I had planned every detail, from her favorite wine to the song she danced to with me on our first date. I wanted to rekindle it. I wanted to remind her who we were. But she wanted to extinguish it. The moment I saw her stand up and walk toward him, in the center of the room, wearing the dress I had bought her with such care, something inside me screamed and died at the same time. They danced like two teenagers, as if they were the only ones there, while I watched, helpless, with a glass in my hand and my heart in pieces. It was then that I approached and spoke those words. And it was then that I died for her. The cruelest thing about betrayal isn't the physical act. It's the symbolism. It's the disregard for the effort, the history, the love invested. It's her look saying, without saying it, that I'm no longer enough. And what do you do when you become insufficient for someone who is your world? You fall apart. But I didn't fall apart in front of her. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I didn't ask her to stay. I walked away. But every step hurt. Every memory weighed. And everything we built fell apart on the way back home. A house that night, was no longer a home. She tried to reach out to me afterward. First with short messages, then with long attempts at explanation. As if there were any explanation that could fit in a message. As if there were words that could mend a heart pierced by the coldness of someone who left even though they stayed. When we finally met again, time had already done its work on me. I was no longer mired in hurt or anger. There was only weariness, a serene sadness, a bitter acceptance that love doesn't always win. I looked at her and saw regret. I saw pain. I saw longing. And I also saw love, but a wounded, disfigured love, a love that had arrived too late. She asked me for forgiveness with her eyes before even opening her mouth. She said she'd made a mistake, that she'd confused neediness with love, that she'd traded certainty for uncertainty, that she'd sought a new thrill and ended up finding emptiness. I listened to her respectfully. Because even destroyed, I was still whole enough to listen. But deep down, I already knew that none of that would change what had been done. Love, however strong, has limits. And mine had already been exceeded. When she finished speaking, I waited a few seconds in silence. And then I said what I'd needed to say since that night at the party. I want you to know that I loved you with all my heart, but if it wasn't enough, move on and be happy with someone else who loves you more than I did. And with that, I left. Lighter. Because there I understood that forgiveness isn't reconciliation. It's liberation. And I needed to free myself. What she couldn't imagine was what would come next. The months dragging by, the dull routine, the coffees alone, the bed always cold on one side. The moments when she still heard my voice calling her in the empty house. The places we'd go together, now silent where once there had been laughter. The songs she could no longer hear. And most of all, the box. That box that was stored in the closet of our old bedroom. With the photos from our freshman year, the letters I never had the courage to give her, the tickets to the movies she said she loved and that I insisted on keeping. But what she found last was what hurt the most. An envelope. Inside, a ticket. And a complete travel itinerary for the place she dreamed of visiting. That was the gift I was going to give her for our wedding anniversary. I just didn't have the time. Because while I was planning to surprise her, she was planning to leave me. Reading it, alone, kneeling on the floor of the room that was no longer ours, she cried like she had never cried before. She cried not just for me. She cried for herself. For the choice. For the regret. For the certainty that love like mine, she would never have again. And then, finally, she understood. The weight of betrayal isn't just guilt. It's the knowledge that some losses are forever. It's realizing that while you were dancing with someone new, someone who truly loved you was saying goodbye inside. And that now, even if there is forgiveness, there is no longer us. Only memory. Only absence. But what she didn't expect was that, some time later, life would bring us face to face again. Not at a party, not among people celebrating, but in the silence of an ordinary afternoon. She found me. I was different. More serene. More whole. With a different look. With a different presence by my side. And there, in her eyes, love returned. But it was too late. Because what she had lost, I had rebuilt. And as much as she wanted to return, there was no longer room for her there. Only silence. And the certainty. That life does take its toll. And that not all love survives a wrong choice. But what happened the day she finally found me again? What did she see in my eyes? And what did I see in hers? Did she have the courage to say everything she hadn't said before? Did I still have feelings for her? Was forgiveness the end, or the beginning of another story? Perhaps the most painful thing isn't the betrayal itself, but the day the betrayer realizes they've lost true love. And there's no going back. Welcome to the channel. Here, we do not romanticize or support any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but they carry deep truths about what infidelity can cause in the lives of those who truly love. Our goal is clear, to show, through emotion, that cheating is a choice that comes at a high price, and sometimes irreversible. Prepare yourself. What you are about to hear it will give you goosebumps inside. Take a deep breath. And hold on. Today's story, it's shocking. Her name was Julia. He was Daniel. They were the kind of couple people looked at and believed love could still work. There was something serene in the way they looked at each other, a quiet, almost imperceptible care that imbued everything around them with a sense of peace. They lived in a simple house with large windows and furniture chosen piecemeal as they grew together. They had routines that seemed banal to outsiders, but for them, they formed the center of their lives: coffee with toasted bread on Sundays, silent walks holding hands when words grew tired, the way she adjusted the collar of his shirt before leaving, as if the outside world would be less cruel if he looked well-groomed. Everything about them seemed natural, as if they had been molded for each other. And perhaps they had been. But time sometimes tests even the most perfect fits. Daniel was an architect, passionate about what he did, a meticulous detail-oriented person, the kind who lost himself in the hours drawing. His professional life was always stable, not grandiose, but solid, like everything he built. Julia, on the other hand, was a literature teacher at a private school, and that said a lot about her. She was sensitive, intense, carried her books like someone carrying stories inside their chest, and when she talked about her favorite authors, her eyes filled with a vivid light. They met in a coffee shop, one of those chance encounters that fate seems to have carefully scripted. He was reading a Murakami book, and she made a comment as she passed, smiling. They talked for 20 minutes that afternoon and never left each other again. Their love grew slowly, unhurriedly, like someone learning to know before giving themselves over. And that was precisely what made them seem so right for each other. There was no exaggeration, only truth. They married 3 years later and began to share not only the same roof, but the same dreams. They had plans to travel the world, perhaps adopt a dog, renovate the backyard to create a small vegetable garden, and perhaps have a child when the time was right. They had these kinds of bedtime conversations, with the lights off and their hands clasped under the sheets. Julia loved rainy Sundays, and Daniel loved strong coffee. She made lists for everything. He forgot almost everything he didn't write down. She was emotion, he was reason. But when they fought, because yes, they fought, there was always a common ground in the middle of the argument. They apologized easily, and when they didn't, they found a gesture that spoke volumes. They had learned that love also meant giving in. They had learned, to a certain extent. As the years passed, life began to take on that automatic rhythm that doesn't let you know when it's starting. Routine set in, conversations diminished, touch became a habit. But there was still affection, still admiration. Daniel, even tired, would find ways to surprise her, even with a chocolate bar in the middle of the afternoon or a flower plucked from a random garden on the way to work. Julia, in turn, always left a note or prepared his coffee with extra care on days she knew would be difficult. But, as much as the love still existed, it began to change form. It became quieter. It didn't stop being love, it just became a quiet love. The nights grew shorter. They both always arrived exhausted. She, weighed down by the frustrations of the classroom, by the pressure of keeping students engaged in a world where no one else seemed to listen. He, pressured by deadlines, demanding clients, endless meetings. They began to eat dinner at different times. Go to bed at different times. Little by little, they began to share less. Not for lack of desire, but for a kind of emotional exhaustion neither of them had the courage to admit. And this exhaustion, however slight, when left unaddressed, begins to feed on what remains of their connection. Daniel began to notice Julia's absences. Not physical, but those absences no one talks about. Her eyes wandered more, her smile took longer to come. She seemed restless sometimes. As if something was bothering her and she couldn't explain it. And instead of asking, he remained silent. Perhaps out of fear of the answer, perhaps believing it was just a phase. And she, instead of opening her heart, hid it. Perhaps out of pride, perhaps because she didn't want to hurt anyone. That's when they began to lose touch at home. The affectionate gestures diminished, but the respect remained. And this made them think everything was still okay. After all, they weren't fighting. They still said goodnight. They still shared the electricity bill, the grocery bill, the sofa. But love wasn't the same anymore. Not because it was over, but because it had been left aside for too long. Julia started going out more. To courses, school events, meetings. Daniel, too busy, didn't ask where she was going. Not out of disinterest, but because he trusted. He always had. He always believed the foundation of their relationship was solid enough to weather any storm. And it was. But not every storm comes with thunder. Some arrive with silence. With the absence of a good morning. With a kiss that goes on too quickly. With a glance that doesn't meet the others at dinner. And these, before we know it, have already destroyed what we had. Celebrations still existed, but they lost their power. On their last wedding anniversary, Daniel prepared a simple but special dinner. She thanked him with a light kiss on the cheek and a tired smile. She said she was exhausted. He understood. And that was it. There was no fight, no open resentment. But something hung in the air, like an unspoken detail, an unresolved feeling. Daniel began writing more at night. Not just plans. Just random words. Fragments of thoughts. He tried to understand what was happening, but couldn't name it. Julia, on the other hand, spent more time on her phone, and her spontaneous laughter began to fade from him. When he looked at her, he felt something distant in her eyes, as if she were always miles away. But he didn't ask. And she didn't say. The good memories still existed, but they were being drowned out by a new, tasteless routine. And worst of all, neither of them was to blame. They were both trying. In their own way, with their limits. But trying. But sometimes love, when left untreated, dies dry inside, even if it seems alive on the outside. Julia still admired him. Daniel still loved her. But they were headed in different directions, like two trains that started at the same station but traveled on opposite tracks. One morning, Daniel watched Julia as she brushed her hair in front of the mirror. She didn't notice his gaze. And in that instant, he realized how beautiful she was. As beautiful as the day he met her. But now there was something else there, something he couldn't explain. A weight, perhaps. A distance that hurt to look at. Still, he smiled. He loved that woman. Truly loved her. Even if she no longer noticed. Even if she was drifting away. He still believed that time would mend things. That a gesture, a touch, a look, might be enough to start over. What Daniel didn't know, however, was that time is sometimes merciless to those who wait too long to act. That night, Julia arrived later than usual. She said she had a long meeting. He responded with a wave and a weak smile. She went straight to the shower. He went to his room. When she came out, he was already in bed. She leaned closer, kissed his forehead, and said goodnight. He responded softly, closing his eyes. And that's how they fell asleep, side by side, yet miles apart. Outside, the world went on. People smiled, couples argued, children ran through the streets. But inside, in that silent house, two hearts beat at different rhythms. And something big was about to happen. Something that would change everything. Something that, even though they didn't know it yet, would leave deep scars. Scars that neither time nor forgiveness would be able to completely erase. September arrived like a warm breeze, bringing with it a breeze of vague promises and a sky that, despite its blueness, seemed to carry something in the air, a feeling that things, however quietly, were about to change. Daniel went about his daily routine like a man who believed he was fulfilling his role. Projects piled up on his desk, tight deadlines, and a client list that demanded ever more energy. He felt exhausted, but resigned, as if that fatigue were already part of his identity. Julia, on the other hand, seemed more alive than ever. Her schedule was full, her eyes had once again sparkled with a certain intensity in recent days, and this didn't go unnoticed by Daniel, though he wasn't sure how to interpret that sudden glow. She went out more, smiled more. She talked less about himself and more about herself. She said she was involved in new projects at school, new colleagues, new challenges. He listened attentively, but always with a shadow of doubt slowly forming, like a distant cloud that can't decide whether to rain or not. There was a new scent about her, something he didn't recognize. The first time he smelled it, he found it enchanting. Then she began to associate that scent with a subtle strangeness, as if it didn't belong in their routine. The clothes changed. The way she applied her makeup, too. Julia was different, and Daniel, even though he didn't want to admit it, was starting to notice. Sundays that used to be reserved for the two of them became more solitary. She said she was tired, wanted to sleep in, or sometimes invented an unavoidable commitment. He spent his mornings making coffee that he ended up drinking alone. And it was in this silence that he began to imagine things. But he didn't suspect it yet. Not clearly. There was still a kind of blind faith within him, a trust that refused to die, even when everything pointed to failure. Conversations no longer flowed. When they did talk, it was about trivial matters. The grocery store, bills, car maintenance. They no longer talked about dreams. About plans. About the future. He, however, tried to stay present. He'd text her in the middle of the afternoon, asking if she needed anything, offering rides. But he always received quick, curt responses, as if he were bothering her. Still, he resisted the idea of questioning. He'd rather fool himself, perhaps, than face the possibility of a cruel truth. It was easier to pretend it was just a phase. Until it wasn't. One Thursday night, Julia announced there would be a teachers' get-together to celebrate the completion of a project. Daniel asked if she wanted him to pick her up later, but she politely declined. She said she'd take a ride-sharing service. Not to worry. He smiled, even though he felt the uneasiness throbbing deep in his chest. When she left, he sat on the couch, the television on low, his eyes fixed on nothing. He couldn't say why, but that night felt different. There was something about her that made him uneasy. Maybe it was the dress. Or the high heels she rarely wore. Maybe it was the way she applied her lipstick, more carefully. Or how she avoided looking him directly in the eye before leaving. But he said nothing. He just said good night and was left with that silence stuck in his throat. She returned late. It was past midnight. Daniel pretended to be asleep, but his body wouldn't let him. He heard the key jingle, light footsteps down the hallway, the bedroom door slowly opening. Julia walked to the bathroom, took off her earrings, and washed her face. When she lay down, she kept a greater distance than usual. Daniel caught the scent of that new perfume, now mixed with a faint hint of alcohol and something else, something that made him squeeze his eyes tightly, as if trying to expel an image that didn't even exist yet, but already hurt. The next day, she acted normally. She made coffee, talked about the school schedule, and commented on the weather. Daniel responded kindly, but inside, something was beginning to break. It was as if he were being awakened from a dream. He spent the rest of the week in a state of silent vigil. He observed. He noticed. He tried to fit together the pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to put together. With every detail, every sly laugh on her phone, every message she hid with a quick tap on the screen, he began to understand that there was something between them. Something invisible. Something that had perhaps been there for longer than he cared to admit. It was a Saturday afternoon that everything truly began to take shape. Julia was getting ready for another, professional meeting. This time, Daniel didn't offer to take her. He just watched her. The same dress. The same perfume. The same strange glint in her eyes. When she left, he stood still for a few minutes, staring at the closed door, as if she were still there. Something inside him gave way. And for the first time, he felt the need to find out. Not out of jealousy. Not out of revenge. But out of an urgent need to keep from going mad with doubt. It wasn't hard to find information. Julia wasn't exactly discreet. Daniel began piecing together details, times, locations. And when he thought it was just an exaggeration in his head, an instinct guided him to the truth. It wasn't in a compromising message. It wasn't in an unexpected phone call. It was in a photograph. A simple photo posted on a social media account by a high school friend. The image showed a group at a lively dinner. And there, in the background, amid laughter and glasses of wine, was Julia. Sitting next to a man he'd never seen. Her gaze wasn't that of a coworker. It was intimate. Complicit. Her smile, too light. Too natural. Too familiar to be innocent. Daniel stood there, staring at the photo for long minutes, as if time had stopped. That image said more than 1,000 words could. It was what was missing. The confirmation he so feared. In the days that followed, he didn't confront her. Not yet. He needed more. He needed to understand. He wanted to hear it from her lips, wanted to see it in her eyes. He spent the week observing, feeling, analyzing every gesture, every word. The house was now a stage. Julia smiled, Daniel acted. The words between them flowed again, but they were cold. Disguised. He knew. And she, perhaps she knew he knew. But they both played along. Until the night of the party. It was a spring celebration, an event among friends and colleagues, where couples danced, toasted, and took photos. Daniel believed this would be the moment of truth. He dressed nicely, like old times. He applied perfume and styled his hair more carefully. They arrived together, hand in hand, but it felt like two strangers sharing the same journey. Julia was visibly anxious. She talked to everyone, smiled too much. And then, he realized. Her eyes were searching for someone. And then she saw him. The man in the photo. He approached naturally, as if he were already a part of her life. And Julia, upon meeting him, changed. Her body leaned in slightly, her smile became more genuine. And when the music began, Daniel watched in silence as his wife let go of his hand and walked toward him. The room filled with lights, people dancing, laughter, and conversation. But Daniel could only see one thing, his wife, dancing with another man. Her gaze. The connection. The surrender. It was enough. It was more than enough. He approached slowly. Neither of them noticed. Julia laughed, the other twirled her around to the beat of the music. And when they finally saw him, Daniel was already standing before them. There was no anger in his gaze. There was pain. A contained, deep, almost peaceful pain. He looked at her and, in a low, firm voice, said everything that needed to be said. The dancing stopped. The laughter ceased. The room, for a second, seemed to lose its sound. Julia tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Daniel just stared at her for a moment longer, then turned and left. Without shouting, without scandal. Only with the dignity of someone who truly loved. And with a shattered heart. But what Julia didn't yet know was that there was something more. Something she would discover very soon. Something hidden. Something he had prepared. And that, when it came to light, would not only make her understand the extent of what she had lost, but also what she could never get back. The light rain beat against the windowpane as if accompanying the heavy melody that had occupied Julia's chest since the night he left. The silence of the house, now cruel, seemed to laugh at her with each footstep echoing against the cold floor. The days dragged by, the looks on others' faces began to change, and even the mirror no longer reflected the same woman. She tried to keep going, but couldn't. She tried to distract herself, immerse herself in work, smile at social gatherings, feign naturalness when the subject was him. But there was something burning inside her, an urgency, a remorse that pushed her to the brink of unbearability. Life was no longer the same. And what had once seemed like an exhilarating freedom now became a daily prison. She found herself listening to the songs he loved, returning to the places where they used to hold hands, remembering the little things he did, like warming her towel in the winter, or making her chamomile tea when she had a migraine. His absence was now a constant presence. For weeks, she hesitated to seek him out. She thought she needed time to understand what she felt, but the truth was, she didn't want to face the weight of her guilt. Until the weight became greater than her cowardice. And so, after much indecision, she went after him. She didn't know what to expect, nor if he would agree to see her, but she needed to say everything her heart had been screaming in the silence of her sleepless nights. When she finally found him, he seemed different. There was something serene in his expression, a calm that immediately disarmed her. He was sitting in a small, inconspicuous café, the same one where they'd first met years ago, as if fate were ironically returning them to the scene of their beginning to seal an end. When he saw her, he didn't immediately stand up. He just looked at her. There was no hurt in his eyes. But there was no longing either. This unnerved her. She sat across from him, her heart racing, her gaze restless. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. She was the first to break the silence. She said there wasn't enough justification, but she needed to try to explain. She told him how lost she felt, how she'd become confused trying to find a new version of herself and ended up moving away from the only place where she was truly loved. He just listened. Without interrupting. Without looking away. When she said she regretted it, that she'd understood his value too late, that she still loved him, and that she wanted to start over, Daniel closed his eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then smiled. But it wasn't a smile of joy. It was a smile of resigned sadness. He responded calmly, saying he forgave her. And she couldn't hold back her tears. She cried like she hadn't cried in a long time. She cried for having lost him, for not realizing it sooner, for having thrown away the truest love she'd ever known. But when she finally felt there was a way to try to return, he shook his head gently and said that forgiveness didn't mean a new beginning. Not for the two of them. He'd found another path. Another peace. Another direction. Julia was shocked. She tried to argue, to beg, but he just held her hand for a few seconds and asked her to listen. Daniel then pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket and handed it to her. Inside was a piece of paper, old, dated 2 months before the betrayal. It was a letter. Julia recognized his handwriting and, with trembling hands, began to read. The letter spoke of his love for her. About how he was preparing for a new phase in his life. He spoke of the surprise he wanted to give her, a trip for two, to celebrate their years together. A renewal of their vows. He spoke of how he had secretly saved money to take her to Tuscany, where she had always dreamed of being. He told her how he had already booked the places, made reservations at restaurants she had shown him in photos. How he planned to propose again, in the same simple style as the first proposal, with a different, custom-made ring with their initials inside. Julia began to tremble. The letter was a gift from the man she had betrayed, lovingly planned as she surrendered herself to the arms of another. But there was more. A note attached to the end, written after the separation, completed the final blow. It said that, upon rereading that letter, she cried like she had never cried in her life. That she had burned the travel reservation because she couldn't bear the thought of being there with someone else. That burying that dream hurt, but it was necessary. That the letter would only be delivered if one day she had the courage to look at him again and tell him she still loved him. And there she was, looking at that paper, listening to the words of the man she loved, written at a time when he still believed in her. Julia broke down. She tried to say something, but no word seemed worthy. She looked at him with teary eyes and begged for a chance, any chance. He responded with a calm but firm look. He told her she was part of his story, and that part would always be respected. But now he was in a different place. He told her there was someone in his life, someone who arrived with sweetness and truth, without promises, but with presence. He told her it wasn't about revenge, but about self-respect. That forgiving her was an act of love for himself. And that even if a shadow of feeling still lingered, he could no longer offer her what he once offered body and soul. Julia wept uncontrollably. The pain of betrayal, which had once been his, now inverted with brutal force. She tried to hug him, but he gently pulled away. He said he had gotten over it, but that he would never forget. That her every gesture, every choice, had pushed him toward a version of himself that had learned to rebuild itself after the pain. And that there was no longer room for her in that new life. He then stood, left the envelope on the table, and walked toward the exit. Before he left, he looked at her one last time and said, almost in a whisper, that he hoped she would find herself again, but that she wouldn't look for him again. She nodded, unable to fight her guilt. And she sat there, with the letter in her hands, feeling the world silently crumble around her. On the way back, Daniel breathed deeply. There was no euphoria, no sense of victory. There was relief. There was peace. And also a slight sadness for all that could have been. But above all, there was certainty. The certainty that he was now walking in his own footsteps, unburdened by the weight of the past. Julia, for her part, spent the night rereading the letter. Each word was a stab in the back. Now she understood what she had lost. And that nothing, absolutely nothing, would bring it back. Not regret. Not tears. Not belated love. And that's how she realized that the worst punishment isn't being left behind. It's discovering that, even after all your regrets, someone moved on, and learned to live without you. The next morning, the world seemed to move forward as always, but inside Julia, everything had stopped. The weight of the letter still vibrated in her purse as if it were made of lead, and each time she tried to feign normality, a passage returned to her memory like a thin blade slowly cutting through. The city pulsed outside, the traffic, the everyday noises, the mechanical movement of people going about their lives as if the ground hadn't collapsed beneath their feet. But within her, there was a rupture. An uncomfortable silence between one breath and the next. And a constant feeling of delay, as if she were rushing to catch up with something that had already departed. And it had. Daniel was no longer there. Not in her eyes, not in her gestures, not in her intentions. That reunion, which for her was the starting point of a rebuilding, had been the end of it. The definitive goodbye. And now, with everything delivered, everything said, all that remained was to face the rubble and try to move on alone. In the following days, Julia tried to resume her routine, but nothing felt right. The classroom felt cold, the books lost their color, and the students seemed distant. Conversations with classmates became a string of words she barely paid attention to. And when she returned home, everything seemed to scream his name. The couch, where he used to lay his head in her lap on movie nights. The cup with the cracked handle he insisted on using. The bedroom curtains he'd changed himself one morning, after a weekend spent doing nothing but existing together. She began to perceive Daniel's absence as a kind of haunted presence. He was everywhere. And at the same time, nowhere. On the third weekend after their reunion, Julia received an invitation to an alumni event at the school where she worked. She had avoided going out recently, but something inside pushed her to accept. Perhaps she needed movement, perhaps she wanted to escape the shadow of what she had lost. The event venue was a cultural gallery in the old town, where exhibitors presented photographs and projects linked to the residents' emotional memories. It was a place full of memories and small nostalgic details, as if timed and moved in slow motion. Julia arrived accompanied by a friend, tried to distract herself, chatted with acquaintances, until in one of the exhibition rooms, something stopped her in her tracks. There was a panel with a series of black and white portraits, all depicting couples in simple, everyday scenes, one making coffee for the other, a lingering embrace at the gate, a note left on the table. And among these images, one made her heart race. It was her. And it was Daniel. Sitting on a park bench, they were both smiling, he with his arm around her, she with her eyes closed, laughing at something he'd said. The photo was old. She hadn't even remembered that moment being captured. But there it was. Immortalized. Untouchable. Unattainable. Julia stood before the image for several minutes. Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't cry. That photo was more than a memory. It was proof that, at one point, she had had it all. Everything that now became just an image on a wall, seen by strangers, interpreted by unfamiliar eyes. And it was there, in that white, varnish-scented space, that a familiar voice appeared beside her. Daniel. No warning. No drama. Just him, standing a few inches away, also looking at the photo. She turned slowly, as if unsure if it was real. He looked different. Lighter, perhaps. But his eyes still held a depth she recognized immediately. She greeted him with a discreet nod. He responded with a small, almost respectful smile. Julia said she hadn't known the photo would be there. He replied that neither had he. And then silence fell between them, no longer filled with hurt or tension, but with something only those who have loved deeply can carry, respect for a past that was real. She took advantage of their closeness to ask how he was. He told her he'd started drawing again for pleasure, that he was working less and sleeping better. He said he'd learned to walk more slowly, to cook new things, and that he'd met someone who made him laugh easily. Julia nodded. She asked, with almost invisible effort, if he was happy. He didn't lie. He said yes. And that hurt, but it was a relief at the same time. Because, deep down, she wanted him to be okay. Even if it wasn't with her. They remained there, staring at their own image on the wall, as if they were two ancient versions observing what was left of what they once were. Julia then commented that, even though she didn't deserve it, she was grateful to have been loved that way. Daniel replied that loving her had been one of the purest experiences he'd ever had. And that, however bitter the ending, he was still proud of the love he'd given. There was no accusation in his words. Only truth. And that honesty made her crumble inside once again. Before they said goodbye, she called his name in a low voice, as if to cherish that moment. She said that if he ever completely forgave her, she wanted him to know that it wasn't just a mistake. It was the greatest loss she'd ever faced. And that if there was any weight left with him, he should know that she would carry it twice as much, every day. Daniel, in the same calm tone, said there was no more weight. Only learning. And that he hoped she would truly find herself again. After that, he lightly touched her shoulder as a gesture of goodbye and walked away without looking back. Julia stood there, paralyzed. The faces in the other photos around her seemed to watch her, silent. She understood that she was no longer part of his present. That she now belonged only to the story they had lived together, a beautiful, intense story, but one that would never continue. And this understanding, devastating as it was, also brought a new clarity. There was nothing more to be said. Nothing to be done. Just move on. Carrying the memory, the regret, and perhaps, one day, full forgiveness for herself. In the following months, she began to rebuild her life. Not for Daniel's sake, but for her own. She began searching for new meanings, new paths, and even though there were still holes in her soul, she was learning to live with them without losing herself. From time to time, she passed by places that brought back memories. And on those occasions, she smiled with a little pain and a little gratitude. Because as much as she had lost, she also knew, albeit late, the value of what she had. And that, somehow, kept her human. As for Daniel, he continued with his new life. No longer with a heavy heart, but with his chest open to the new. He was a different man now. Not because he stopped loving Julia, but because he learned to love himself enough to accept no less than he deserved. He moved forward unhurriedly, without resentment, with the serenity of someone who gave everything they could. And with the certainty that sometimes true love isn't the one that lasts, but the one that transforms us even after it's gone. After that last conversation in front of the photograph, life began to move with a different kind of silence for both of them. It was no longer the silence of absence, of doubt, or of pent-up grief, but a silence of acceptance, of endings that aren't written with words, only with choices. Julia left the gallery that day without looking back, but something inside her still hesitated to move forward. It wasn't for him anymore, nor out of a sense of possession or insistence. It was for herself. For the image she now had to reconstruct in the mirror every morning. Because if there was one thing for sure, it was this: she was no longer the same woman she'd been before. He was no longer someone who could walk around believing that choices don't come at a price. The loss she carried was a lesson tattooed on her soul. Living with it was like living with a scar, visible only to those who know exactly where to look. She began to live with more introspection. She avoided talking about relationships, not because she had lost faith in love, but because she understood, now more than ever, that love requires presence, awareness, and above all, truth. The superficiality with which some people threw themselves into new stories frightened her. She knew the damage emotional neglect can cause, the damage of not caring for what you have until it's gone. Even though the days had some rhythm back, the nights were still haunted by memories. And they weren't memories of guilt, those had already been faced until they wore thin. They were memories of a time when she felt safe, whole, and accompanied by someone who saw her beyond what she could see in herself. The pain wasn't just from losing Daniel, but from having abandoned the purest version of herself by letting him slip away. Meanwhile, he followed his new path with firm but unhurried steps. He'd never been one to need to prove anything to the world. He found in another woman a kind of peace he hadn't known before, not because she was better or worse than Julia, but because she'd come at the right time, in the right way, and most importantly, without any open wounds. The new relationship wasn't about filling voids, but about sharing what remained after he'd rebuilt himself. Every gesture was careful, without comparisons, without pressure. Daniel had learned to listen to his own silences before interpreting those of others. And this made him more attentive, more present, more grateful. There was within him an understanding that can only be achieved after being torn in half and having to put yourself back together with your own hands. The occasional reunion between the two, now inevitably former companions in an unfinished story, happened again a few weeks later, at a family restaurant where they both used to go. It was casual, unexpected, and fraught with an almost uncomfortable politeness. He was with someone. She was alone. They exchanged no more than glances. But in that look was a profound understanding, that life had truly moved on. There was no more hope, no more anger, no more stifled pain. Only the recognition that, however intense love may be, when it breaks in certain ways, there's no seam that can bring it back to how it was before. That night was especially difficult for Julia. Not because of jealousy, but because she realized with absolute clarity that she was now just a page read, no longer part of his present. The new woman beside Daniel was simple, discreet, and smiled with the lightness of someone who hadn't yet learned the weight of losing someone. Julia, watching from afar, understood that that kind of smile had once been hers. And that she lost it when she stopped protecting the relationship with the truth. From that point on, the decisions she made began to carry greater weight. Julia withdrew from shallow relationships, declined invitations that lacked substance, and preferred to be alone rather than in bad company. Little by little, the emptiness began to transform into space. He began painting, something he had never done before. He found in the brush a silent way to organize his feelings. The colors spoke for her what words could no longer say. He began attending art fairs, small exhibitions, and cultural workshops. He began connecting with people who were also rebuilding. And it was in this process of self-discovery, in this deep dive into her own pain, that she began to reclaim forgotten parts of herself, not the woman he loved, but the woman she needed to become again for her. One day, she was invited to exhibit a series of paintings at a local fair. She accepted. Not out of vanity, but because she understood it was a form of liberation. Among the works she exhibited, there was one in particular, a black, white, and blue canvas with disordered lines intertwining in an imperfect spiral. The work's name, The Place Where I Lost Myself. It was the one that attracted the most attention. Many approached, interpreted it differently, praised it, and asked about the creative process. But no one truly understood what the painting represented. Except her. That spiral was her heart trying to reorganize itself. It was chaos trying to dress itself in peace. At that same fair, among the many faces passing by, one in particular watched her with discreet interest. A man, apparently her age, with calm eyes and a book of poetry tucked under his arm. He didn't say anything right away. He just walked around, observed, and returned. Late in the afternoon, he approached her and said that the work had touched him deeply, as if he too had experienced something similar. Julia just smiled. He asked if she was the author. She confirmed it. And then they talked. About art. About pain. About new beginnings. The conversation was light, natural, like two people who knew the value of silence and listening. She didn't feel butterflies. She felt peace. And that was new. For the first time in a long time, she didn't feel the urge to run away, or to prove something. Just being there. Time passed. Encounters repeated themselves, slowly. A coffee, a visit to a bookstore, a stroll through a square. Nothing rushed. Nothing demanded. Julia allowed herself to discover a different kind of companionship, a kind of affection that didn't compare, just welcomed. It wasn't a substitute. It was a new chapter, written with care and awareness. There were days when she still remembered Daniel. Not with pain, but with respect. He had been an important love, and always would be. But now, missing him was no longer a longing to return. It was missing someone who had taught her so much, even if through a difficult path. The moral dilemma she carried no longer weighed so heavily. She had accepted the consequences of the choices she had made, and because of this, she began to experience a freedom that came not from the absence of guilt, but from the presence of awareness. Daniel, for his part, continued firmly in his new life. With the same calm, gentle presence that had always characterized him. He still had memories of Julia, but now they were tucked away in a corner of his heart where there was no echo, only silence and gratitude. He didn't seek to know how she was, but at certain moments, when he saw something they both enjoyed, a movie, a book, a place, he would allow himself to remember for a few seconds. Then he would return to the present with serenity, knowing that the love he felt for her had fulfilled its cycle. He had given everything. And now, he received from life what he had cultivated, peace. There was something beautiful about the way their stories unfolded. Because even if they didn't end up together, they ended up whole. Pain wasn't avoided, but endured. Regret wasn't denied, but faced. Love wasn't destroyed, it was transformed. Life had done what needed to be done. And now, they both walked forward, not as victims of a sad story, but as survivors of a love that, though lost, had taught them to live with more depth, more honesty, more courage. The dilemma that had lingered over Julia for so long, whether she would ever deserve forgiveness, whether she could ever be happy again, now found answers in small gestures. In every step she took alone. In every person she spoke to without fear. Every time she looked at a painting of herself and knew there was a reflection of someone no longer hiding. She understood that the hardest forgiveness was the one she needed to give herself. And even though that love had been painfully ripped from her life, she still knew, she had survived. And time, always time, which once drove her away from Daniel, now brought her closer to herself. He no longer sought explanations for the past. Nor justifications. He simply felt. And continued. Because some stories cannot be returned. But they have a continuation. And that continuation was just beginning. The following weeks arrived laden with subtle, silent, yet decisive transformations. Julia had begun something new with the man she'd met at the art fair, and though she didn't want to name what they were building, she recognized the difference in rhythm, in energy, in the way he looked at her without expecting to complete her, just to get to know her. There was a gentleness in the way he waited for her pauses, respected her absences, and demanded no rush. She felt she could be herself, without needing to disguise the traces of what she once was, without needing to pretend she was whole while still rebuilding herself from within. His name was Lucas, and he had a way of observing the world that enchanted effortlessly. A poet of soul, though he'd never published any verse. He listened more than he spoke, but when he spoke, his words left a trace. He didn't try to understand Julia's past beyond what she was willing to reveal. He didn't force memories, but neither did he shy away from them when they arose. He was a rare kind of presence, gentle, yet firm. Someone who knew that time was of the essence for scars to stop bleeding and finally become just marks. On a cloudy Saturday, they decided to hike a trail outside the city. Julia wasn't a fan of long hikes, but she accepted the invitation as someone who understands that sometimes the body needs to be removed from the place where the mind hides. The trail led to a little-known viewpoint with a sweeping view of a valley filled with trees in shades of deep green and burnt yellow. The path was quiet, but never uncomfortable. When they reached the top, they sat on a large rock. Lucas opened a thermos of mint tea and offered it to her. They stayed there, gazing at the horizon, until Julia broke the silence and said that for a long time, she thought she would never allow herself anything real again. He didn't respond immediately. He simply held her hand, not looking directly at her. After a while, he whispered, "You don't have to rush. The truth comes when we stop rushing." She smiled, her eyes filling with tears. Not with sadness, but with relief. For the first time in a long time, she felt she didn't need to protect herself. The meetings continued for a few more weeks. They were simple, almost always filled with walks, coffees, or small exhibitions. Julia felt comfortable, but at the same time cautious. There was a part of her that still resisted. Not out of fear of Lucas, but out of respect for the grieving process she was still going through, even though Daniel had long since left her life. It was as if, even though she was experiencing something new, a part of her was still mourning the version of herself she had to abandon to survive. And she needed to honor that grief before giving herself over completely again. Lucas understood. He never pressured. There was a maturity about him that made everything easier. And that, more than any display of affection, was what touched her most. One late afternoon, they decided to visit an old second-hand bookstore downtown. Lucas loved old books, and Julia had always enjoyed the smell of yellowed pages. While browsing the dusty shelves, she came across a book of letters written by anonymous lovers throughout the 20th century. Curious, she began to leaf through it. On one of the pages was a short but powerful letter. He spoke of regret, of loving too much and still losing. Julia felt her heart sink. Lucas, noticing her gaze, leaned closer. She showed him the excerpt, and he simply commented, "Love isn't always enough. But if it's true, it always transforms." The sentence hit her like a gentle blow. Because that's exactly what it was. What she experienced with Daniel wasn't enough to resist the wrong choice. But it was enough to transform her profoundly. And that somehow gave meaning to the pain she'd endured. That night, returning home, Julia lay alone and thought about everything she'd experienced since the beginning. Not just the marriage, the betrayal, the separation. But the rebuilding. The mistakes, the falls, the days she wanted to disappear, the others she struggled to get back up. She no longer felt weak or guilty. She felt human. For the first time in years, she could look at herself in the mirror without guilt. And that was what mattered most now. Meanwhile, Daniel lived his own silences. He wasn't the type of man to overshare feelings, but he had learned to process them deeply. His current relationship was stable, secure, and mature. He didn't need constant proof, just presence. Still, there were times when his mind wandered. Not out of longing or a desire to relive the past, but out of genuine curiosity about what life had made of Julia. He didn't look for her. He didn't scour social media. But sometimes, he imagined. And in those moments, instead of sadness, there was a kind of silent respect. Like someone rooting from afar for someone who was once a fundamental part of their own story. One afternoon, passing by a park where he used to walk with Julia, Daniel sat on the same bench where, years ago, they'd talked for hours about books, movies, and simple dreams. Beside him was Clara, his current companion. She noticed his distant look and asked if everything was okay. He nodded. And after a few seconds, he recounted a memory of a long-ago conversation they'd had there. Clara listened attentively, without jealousy or fear. And in the end, she simply said, "The right people, even when they don't stay, leave roots in us." And that, too, is love. Daniel squeezed her hand affectionately. He didn't need to say anything else. Time followed its course. The seasons changed. The landscapes transformed. And with them, Julia and Daniel too. Their routines no longer bore any trace of each other, but the lessons of what they had experienced still echoed in their choices, their words, their gestures. The story they lived together was not a mistake, nor something that needed to be erased. It was a page written with everything they had at the time. With truth, with flaws, with beauty and pain. And even though it ended as it did, it was real. Months later, Julia received an invitation to exhibit her work in a regional exhibition of contemporary artists. Among the pieces she selected was a new series, Renaissance. Abstract paintings in shades of burnt red, deep blue, and faded white. Each represented a stage of her journey, the fall, the mourning, the forgiveness, and the new beginning. On the opening day, Lucas was by her side. Discreet, proud, calm. Visitors praised her, commented, and asked questions. Julia responded calmly, without the anxiety of someone seeking approval. She knew what was there was her soul exposed, and she was at peace with that. At one point, as she looked at the front door, her heart skipped a beat. Daniel was there. Alone. With a respectful smile on his face. He approached slowly, admired the works in silence, and when he stopped in front of Forgiveness, the most intense work in the series, he gave a slight nod. Then he walked over to Julia and greeted her with a restrained but genuine hug. They spoke only a few words. She thanked him for coming. He replied, "I needed to see what you built with pain." She simply smiled. There were no more tears, no more questions. Just presence. And gratitude. After that, he left. And she remained. Standing. Whole. With the feeling that, finally, everything was where it needed to be. The past at peace. The present with meaning. And the future, open, but now without fear. Because life, despite everything, always finds a way to begin again. Even when all seemed lost. Time had done its part. What seemed impossible to bear was slowly absorbed by a new routine, by new perspectives, by days that no longer held the same pain, only a faint echo of it. The two had gone their separate ways, and although there was no longer an us, there was a strange harmony in realizing that, somehow, everything had resolved itself where it needed to. Julia continued investing in her art, gaining recognition for the emotional intensity of her paintings. People saw themselves in them. People who had loved, who had lost, who had made mistakes, and who had also been betrayed by their own choices. Her name began to circulate in small galleries, cultural events, and independent exhibitions. Lucas remained by her side, always discreet but present, offering support with the same quiet firmness that had won her over from the beginning. They didn't yet live together. She still needed space, time to understand the woman she had become, but they were building something slowly, without haste, without fear. It was a relationship that grew through consistency, not urgency. One day, during an event where her works were to be taken to another state, Julia received the news that her Renaissance series had been invited to participate in an international exhibition. She wept silently in the gallery bathroom. Not out of pride. But because she understood that there was proof that her pain was not in vain. That every bit of anguish and loss she felt served something greater. She transformed her ruin into art. And more than that, into redemption. Lucas was the first to learn of her achievement. He hugged her tightly and simply said, "You deserve it." Those two words were more powerful than any statement. Because there was no audience, no show, no performance. There was only truth. Meanwhile, Daniel was experiencing a period of tranquil stability. His relationship with Clara had evolved naturally, and they now lived together in a more secluded house, surrounded by trees and silence. They had a dog they adopted, they cultivated a small vegetable garden, and their late afternoons were filled with simple conversations about the day, travel plans, and dreams that were slowly emerging. He wasn't seeking intensity. He was seeking depth. He knew, more than ever, that true love didn't shout, didn't make a fuss. It was built on the details. On ordinary days. On the way Clara heated his coffee when he forgot to drink it. On the way he noticed the way she tied her hair. It was a different kind of love. Calmer. More mature. But no less true. On a cold winter morning, Daniel received a letter with no return address. The handwriting, however, was instantly recognizable. It was from Julia. For a moment, he hesitated to open it. But there was something about it that felt different. And it was. It wasn't a plea for him to return, nor a letter of regret. It was a goodbye. An emotional farewell. She thanked him. Not for leaving her, but for having loved so intensely and loyally while she could. She told him that she now understood the weight of what she had thrown away and that, no matter how much time passed, certain wounds only healed when we accepted that some losses cannot be compensated. She said she hoped he was happy, truly happy, and that, no matter what life had in store, he would always be part of the best of it. Daniel read the letter sitting on the porch. He didn't cry. But he felt his chest warm and then lighten. It was the last knot being untied. The last memory that needed to be released so that everything could finally be at peace. That same month, he and Clara took their first big trip together. They went to the south of France, where they walked narrow streets and sipped wine in small cafes. On one of these walks, he held her hand tighter. Clara looked surprised. He smiled and said, "I never thought I could feel this way again. Thank you for teaching me that loving again isn't a betrayal of the past." She kissed him gently. She hadn't responded with words. Only with the certainty in her eyes that they were in the right place at the right time. On the other side, Julia was boarding a plane for a new exhibition. The plane was leaving in a few hours. Lucas drove her to the airport. They walked together to the gate, and there he gave her a long hug. She, overcome with emotion, said she couldn't thank him enough for showing up just when she thought she'd never feel anything real again. He replied quietly, "I just did what anyone should do with someone rebuilding themselves, stay silent and hold their hand when needed." She boarded the plane smiling. Not because she was forgetting the past, but because it no longer paralyzed her. Already on the flight, as she gazed out the window, Julia reflected on how life had turned around. She was no longer that woman full of fragile certainties. She had become someone more aware, stronger, and above all, freer. He knew that, for everything he had done, he would never get back what he had lost. But he also knew he had been able to transform the destruction he had caused into something new, honest, and deeply human. And perhaps, in the end, that was all he could do. A few years later, at a major exhibition in Italy, a journalist asked her what the source of so much emotion was in her art. Julia smiled, her eyes slightly teary, and simply replied, "Pain taught me to paint. Forgiveness taught me to live." That answer spread around the world, quoted in magazines, articles, and interviews. But for her, it was just a truth whispered aloud. There was no need to explain anything anymore. She had made peace with life. Daniel and Clara, in turn, became parents to a baby girl. Holding her in his arms for the first time, he understood what an absolute new beginning was. Not because it erased what had come before, but because it gave him a new purpose. And in that moment, everything fell into place. He looked at Clara and whispered, "Now it all makes sense." There was no more room for regret. Only for gratitude. For what was, for what wasn't, and, most importantly, for what had become. And Julia, on the other side of the ocean, as she finished her presentation, walked alone along the edge of a canal, breathing deeply, feeling the cold wind on her face. She smiled silently. She didn't need anyone by her side at that moment. She was complete. For the first time, complete within herself. If you've made it this far, with a full heart and a thoughtful mind, tell us what you thought of this story in the comments. We want to hear your opinion, your perspective on each part, each decision, each sacrifice. Take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, because there are still many stories like this waiting for you, stories that touch, transform, and make us look within. And before you leave this thought with you: betrayal doesn't just destroy a relationship. It destroys trust, extinguishes dreams, hurts the self-esteem of those who were loyal, and slowly kills the purity of a feeling that could last a lifetime. It's not just a mistake, it's a choice that exacts its toll. Sometimes the bill comes silently, sometimes with tears, but it always comes. The pain of someone who's been betrayed doesn't fade with time, it transforms, and transforms those who survive it. This channel does not support, encourage, or normalize any type of betrayal. Here, we believe that true love is only built through truth, loyalty, and presence. He takes care of himself. And until the next story.